Today, we are going to take a look into history. We're going to look at Adolf Hitler, we're going to look at the Nazis, and we're going to consider a very important question. And it's one you don't find in the history books that you get in junior high and high school, and not even college for that matter. And that is, how did Adolf Hitler finance his entry into World War II? The history books tell us, as we're growing up, they say, well, Germany was embarrassed by this treaty, and they felt they had been wrongly blamed and unfairly burdened because of World War I, and that's why they rose again. But they never tell you in these books, ever. If they were a destitute country, they had no money at all, they were ravaged by World War I, nothing was left. How did they all of a sudden have this giant military machine? Joining us today is a gentleman who decided to tackle that with two books. One called Who Financed Hitler? The other, Hitler and His Secret Partners. James Poole joins us. Hi, James.
Hi, Eliot.
I know I'm correct in what I said in opening this show, Jim, in that they teach you when you are growing up that Germany was embarrassed, and they felt that the burden on World War I was unfairly placed, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they have this big giant military machine. No, there's never any indication of, we're going to try to explain to you in one sentence how this happened, because they didn't know.
Well, I was a history major as an undergraduate, and this was one of the things that had occurred to me. There was never any mentioning about who financed Hitler. And so that was my initial investigation, is trying to find out where he got the money. Because unlike a lot of other politicians, Hitler came from nowhere. He had little formal education. He had no private source of funds. His family was lower middle class, if anything. He not only built his own political party. I mean, he didn't take over an established party, or he didn't work through the Social Democrat Party or something like that. He built up a political party from scratch, a political party that had a huge private militia. And by huge, I mean, we're talking about, by 1930, had over 100,000 men in their militia. And all this was in the midst of the worst depression in history. And so that was my initial approach to this. Where did he get the money to do this?
And I'm glad somebody has finally decided to do it, because there has not been information available on this in any form. And your own curiosity brought you to do how many years of research in these areas?
I've been working on this for about the last 25 years.
Okay, that's a long time to be researching for books. And during this time, give us an idea of the kinds of people you have talked to that would either corroborate what you found, provide you with new details, or who knows, maybe try to sidetrack you.
Well, in the early and mid-1970s, I was living in Europe, and I traveled extensively in Germany and interviewed many of the people that actually financed Hitler. Surprisingly, most of them, they bragged about it, to be quite frank. They, of course, denied that they knew anything about the Holocaust. After you talked to them a little bit longer, the anti-Semitism had come out in the conversation too, but they bragged about the fact that they helped finance Hitler. Some of these people were German princes. One of my key sources was Frau Winfried Wagner, who is the daughter-in-law of the famous composer, who played a very key role not only in contributing money to Hitler herself in the early 1920s, but she was the link between Henry Ford and Hitler, which is something I'll want to get into a little bit more later.
James Poole joins us. As you can see, this is going to be an interesting discussion today. It's going to be one filled with facts that you have not heard previously, and something that's long overdue. Do you feel there has been any kind of political pressure to keep this information from the public? I would think that this question would have come up in the 50s to scholars or people in academia or even students, or the 60s or 70s. Yet here we are, close to the millennium, and as far as I know, you're one of the few people that's ever even talked about anything like this.
I think there's been an extensive effort to cover up this information. In Germany, in particular, the industrialists after the war wanted to deny any involvement whatsoever. Of course, not all of them were involved, but many were. And they went to great lengths to do this. In the United States, of course, a lot of people didn't want to admit that an American like Henry Ford had contributed money to Hitler. People also wanted to, a lot of the historians have their background in political and diplomatic history and don't really have a good background in economics, and didn't get into it for that reason. So I think there's a whole host of factors there, the reason this has never come up. But definitely there was a lot of cover-up in Germany.
I think most people, if you say Henry Ford, you mean Ford Motor Company? They say, no way. I mean, how can this be? This is a company that has for years been equated with American innovation and American industry and support of American labor. And to hear this kind of thing, yet there is quite a story behind it, isn't there?
Yes, there is. And first of all, I do want to say that this was something that old Henry Ford himself did. And the company really didn't have anything to do with it. In fact, the executives of the company were horrified by this anti-Semitic campaign that old Henry Ford began in the 1920s. And probably our grandparents might remember that in the 1920s, Henry Ford published a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent that just had some of the most vicious anti-Semitic lies and slander, blaming communism on the Jews, blaming revolutions and everything else on the Jews. And so in the 1920s, Henry Ford was well known as an anti-Semite. What people didn't know was that he wanted to spread his anti-Semitic philosophy abroad, and when he learned of a rising politician in Germany called Adolf Hitler, who had some of the same anti-Semitic ideas, he decided to support him.
And of course, very few people know about this, and you've been careful to equate the relationship of Henry Ford and his anti-Semitic activities with his newspaper and himself, and that's it, and leaving the company out of it, because it's easy when you hear the name Ford, just like you hear the name of 50 other companies that had a prominent name behind it, you tend to think of the company and the man as the same operation. But you're making it very clear here that the Ford Motor Company. Now, but did he use the Ford Motor Company at all to provide any equipment to Hitler? Did this go any further?
No, the company was not used at all. And as I said, many of the executives of the company, they tried over a number of years to get him to drop the anti-Semitic campaign. And because it was affecting sales. And so there was never any involvement of the company. He gave his own personal money to Hitler. And Frau Wagner, who I had mentioned earlier, the daughter-in-law of the famous composer, came to the United States on a Wagnerian opera tour. And it was at that time that she approached Ford for money when she was sitting in the box of the opera in Detroit. And I was the first one who had actually talked to her and interviewed her on this topic. And she's a woman who was English by birth, and so she could speak English fluently. And the interview was conducted right in the Wagner Villa, and it was a little bit eerie, the circumstances, because I was sitting on a couch next to her, and she pointed at the couch I was sitting on, and she said, Adolf used to like to sit right there. I felt like getting up or dusting my clothes off or something. But the important thing was, I asked her, I said, do you know anything about Henry Ford contributing money to Hitler? And she said, yes, he told me he had already given to Hitler. And so that was a collaboration of other facts that I had found, and my estimate is that Henry Ford gave between $1 and $3 million to Hitler of his own money.
Now, in terms of 1930s, it probably was a considerable amount of money. I mean, it wasn't extensive. I mean, looking at the budget of a government, but still.
Well, this was the early 1920s, really.
Oh, it's the early 1920s.
1920s, when there was inflation in Germany. When I think at that time, Ernest Hemingway, when traveling in Germany, spent a week at a luxurious German resort. And I think his bill came to about 40 cents in U.S. money.
Okay, well that
shows you how far the U.S. dollar went in Germany at the time.
Okay, if we're talking early 20s, this is a substantial amount of money, yes. Yeah. We are talking to James Poole. He's the author of Who Financed Hitler? Tell us a little bit about the beginnings of the Nazi Party, if you would, and their growth, their platform, their agenda, and how this small group of individuals were able to convince a nation that they should be in power.
Well, when World War I was over, Hitler got out of the army. He was a corporal. He was completely penniless. He had only one real asset, and that was his ability to speak, his oratorical ability. He was very much an anti-communist and an anti-Semite, views that he had picked up in his youth. There was considerable danger of Germany going over to communism in 1919 at the end of World War I. And he spoke out among the troops against communism, and he was noticed by some of his superior officers. He was also noticed by a secret political society called the Tool Society. This was a rabidly anti-Semitic, anti-communist secret organization that had as its members many wealthy people in southern Germany, in Bavaria. They decided to sponsor Hitler, and they gave him considerable money initially, and it was that money that enabled him to get his start. Many of their members were small industrialists in Bavaria, some nobility, princes, counts, people like that. And that was how he got his start initially. He also had support from a man named Ernst Röhm, who was a captain in the army and had considerable power because he controlled the secret army funds that had been set aside to finance the secret reserve army. The Versailles Treaty at the end of World War I limited the number of troops that Germany could have in her army. So the German General Staff had set up secret army funds to fund paramilitary sort of reserve units. And Captain Ernst Röhm gave a lot of this money to Hitler and the Nazis. Interesting thing about the relationship between Hitler and Röhm, Röhm was gay, and at one time Hitler considered him his closest friend, and I tried to see if there was any kind of a sexual relationship between them. Unfortunately, I was not able to get any evidence on that. But we know that it was through Röhm's help that the Nazis built up their first paramilitary units, and Röhm supplied the Nazis with trucks from the Army Reserve supplies, supplied the Nazis with weapons from the Army Reserve depots, and really was very influential in that early stage.
I imagine the information you obtained that the man was gay and they were very close, this would seem a normal thing that you wanted to look into. Obviously, I don't know how it would affect history at all, but it certainly would show a man who... we know that homosexuals were exterminated en masse in Germany.
Well, of course, later on, as I said, Röhm helped him a great deal in the early years.
Right.
And then when Hitler took over and became chancellor, Röhm became the second most powerful man in Germany, commanding this huge stormtrooper Nazi militia, which by that time numbered between 300,000 and 500,000 men. It was larger than the German army. And then the two of them had a falling out because Hitler's new backers, the more prominent industrialists like the Krupps, objected to Rome. And eventually, by the mid-30s, Hitler had Rome executed and murdered. And it was then that there was, after that, a great deal of persecution against gays in Germany.
How fearful was Hitler and the Nazi Party that the communists might eventually take over power in Germany?
Hitler really believed this himself, and historically it's pretty accurate. There was a great danger. I mean, in 1919, at the end of World War I, for a short period of time, communist groups actually did take over Berlin and Munich, the two major cities. And so it was very much touch and go. You know, the Russian Revolution had just happened in Russia, which of course was a country that bordered Germany. And so there was a great deal of fear that communism would spread to Germany. And during the communist uprisings at the end of World War I, a number of people were murdered. And so this was a fear that the German upper and middle classes, it was just their major obsession, this fear of communism. And Hitler later used this in a particularly devious way because fear of communism was legitimate. But Hitler blamed communism on the Jews, which was just completely false. He could do this because a number of the leading communists had just happened to be Jewish. Of course, most communists were not Jewish, and very few Jews were communists. But he was able to use it and blame communism on the Jews, and this brought him a lot of upper class and middle class support.
Give us an idea. Well, let's do this first. We're going to a quick break, and there's a lot more to talk about here. Of course, James Poole joins us. He's the author of Who Financed Hitler and Hitler and His Secret Partners. I'm Eliot Stein with you. James Poole joins us. He's the author of Who Financed Hitler, Hitler and His Secret Partners. We're getting just extraordinary information from our guest today. Let's go back, if we can, to where we went before the break. Would you give us an idea how entrenched was the Jewish population of Germany in business, in government, in financing at the time?
Actually, for a major European country, Germany's size, they had a relatively small Jewish population. For example, Poland and Russia had a much larger Jewish population. The Jews in Germany were fairly well assimilated and had not really experienced extreme kind of persecution like Jews in Russia had experienced. So a key factor to remember is Hitler picked up most of his anti-Semitic ideas when he was living as a youth in Austria. And the old Austrian Empire had a larger Jewish population, a Jewish population that was not as well assimilated. And the anti-Semitism was much more extreme in the Vienna of Hitler's youth. And that was where he got these rabid anti-Semitic ideas. In fact, when Hitler was a young man growing up in Vienna, the mayor of Vienna was the leader of the Anti-Semitic Party, a man named Karl Lueger, who Hitler sort of patterned himself after. So Hitler brought this Austrian anti-Semitism to Germany. Not that there wasn't anti-Semitism in Germany, but it hadn't been extreme before World War I.
Well, you say that the population was small, considering other countries, but what about any kind of power? Back to my original question, how firmly entrenched was the Jewish population, even if it was small in comparison, in financing, in industry, in government professions?
I think in industry there were very few Jews that were involved in industry. There were a number of prominent Jews in banking because historically, from the time of the Middle Ages, Jews had been restricted from various professions except banking. Banking was one of the few professions open to them. But Jews certainly weren't a dominant influence in German banking. Not They weren't nearly as important in banking in Germany as they were in Austria, for example. As far as the government was concerned, the government of the Kaiser that was in power before World War I, there were very few Jews with any influence in German government. After the end of the war and there was democracy in Germany, I would say the Jews were proportionally represented to their size of the population. So really there wasn't, the Jews were a completely innocent victim. Nobody could legitimately accuse them of trying to monopolize anything.
And this is what I'm trying to get at, where this hatred came from, where this decision to engage in anti-Semitism, where it developed from.
Okay, it came from a couple of things. First of all over Europe, there was a terrible undercurrent of Christian anti-Semitism that went back to the Middle Ages. And this was stronger in Germany than in some other countries. So there was always a certain undercurrent. There were a number of intellectuals at the turn of the century. The famous composer Wagner was one of them, who were anti-Semitic and sort of spread an anti-Semitic philosophy in German intellectual circles. Hitler built on that. A lot of those people were some of the ones who financed him. I think more of it came from this terrible fear that the Germans had of communism, and that the way that the anti-Semites were able to try to blame the Russian Revolution on the Jews. Claiming that, people like Trotsky was of Jewish background, things like that. And by the very coincidence that several of the most prominent leaders, a man named Karl Liebknecht and a woman named Rosa Luxemburg, that were leaders of the communist uprising that actually took over Berlin for a short period of time, they happened to be Jewish, and Hitler used that, of course.
So this is something that historically went back centuries.
Oh, yes, it had deep roots in Christian anti-Semitism in Germany, as I say, from the time of the Middle Ages.
But there was no other reason. There was no other kind of political control, industrial control in Germany.
No, not at all.
Okay. We needed to establish that. We were talking to James Poole, who is the author of Who Financed Hitler and His Secret Partners. I'm going to let you continue for a while before we take some questions and things like that, James, to more set up the situation and where the financiers came in, and give us an idea who these people were, if you would. And we're willing to hear a long list if you got them, especially if we're familiar with the names. But let's take it now from the point when the Nazi Party is starting through its emotional appeal. Take Germany and grasp it and its people and its citizens and turn it upside down, and they see this is the only way to go.
Well, one thing that I really haven't mentioned was the economic situation in Germany. At the end of World War I, in the early 1920s, this terrible inflation began in Germany. An inflation that completely wiped out the savings of the middle class. Naturally, of course, Hitler blamed this on the Jews. To people who were extremely desperate, who had a substantial savings in the bank and lost it all, they were very vulnerable to this kind of propaganda. In the early 20s, Hitler built up his strength, and he attempted a premature coup, which failed in 1923, and he was jailed for a short period of time. When he got out of jail, there were basically good times in Germany from 1926 to 1929, and Hitler really didn't do very well. His party was very small. Very few people were giving money to him. In 1929, the World Depression began, and the unemployment in Germany became severe. The communists grew in strength, and a lot of important industrialists and business people became frightened. Hitler's power was increasing. They decided to give money to Hitler as someone who would protect them from the communists. Probably the most important financier of Hitler during that period was a man named Fritz Tusson that was the owner of the Tusson steel industry. This is the largest steel fortune in Germany. So we're dealing with somebody that was really the very top of the wealthy people in Germany, and his money was very important. Hitler was also still getting money from secret army funds. He was getting money from the Tool Society, the secret society. He was very clever at raising money himself, that is through the Nazi Party with their mass following. They were one of the few parties that actually charged admission to their rallies. And Hitler saw that they got a spectacular show with torchlight parades, and of course he was famous for his rebel-rousing speeches, which a lot of people came to hear.
Yeah, he would have been a great concert promoter, and if nothing else, but absolutely, the man knew how to put on a show that appealed emotionally to people and just got them all charged up, and it was hysteria.
This was something that he had studied in depth when he was starting out. For example, he wanted to find out why people became more emotionally involved in a movie in the evening than they did at a matinee in the afternoon. And he attended both the matinee and the evening performance, and he would see that the emotions were stronger in the evening. And he decided that it had nothing to do with, at first he went to, like the opera or the symphony in the afternoon and evening, and then he went to the cinema. And he concluded because at the cinema, the film was exactly the same in the afternoon and evening. There was something, as he said, mystical about the evening itself, that people became more emotionally involved. And that was one of the reasons he decided to have all of his torchlight parades, that he decided to use searchlights and things like that at his rallies. And of course, all this was very new at the time. Nobody else was doing this. The traditional German politician was a rather boring kind of intellectual that basically sort of talked down to his audience and droned on like a university professor of some sort. So Hitler was able to capitalize on this to a great extent. As the Depression grew worse in Germany, the Nazi Party grew larger. At its worst, at about 1930, 1931, 1/3 of the total German workforce was unemployed. And, however, other than Fritz Tusson, the very wealthy steel man that I had talked about, and Henry Ford, who had contributed money in the early 20s, Hitler really wasn't getting money from the really wealthy people of Germany. They were still supporting the traditional parties. His money was coming from some moderately wealthy people like Frau Wagner, some wealthy nobility, but they really were denied the funds of big industry. They hadn't really been able to tap into that yet. And it wasn't until about a year before he came to power that he actually began to get some money from the big chemical cartel and some of the coal cartel and other traditional big industry.
We are talking to James Poole, the author of Who Financed Hitler? Hitler and His Secret Partners. In just a few minutes, we'll take questions from you. We're trying to establish the scenario in Nazi Germany, and you're providing us with just tidbits, facts, and anecdotes that we haven't heard previously, especially about this thing about holding these rallies at nighttime, because he learned that people have more of an emotional vulnerability at that time.
Yeah, very much so. In fact, I have some pictures in the book. I believe it's in the book Who Financed Hitler, of Hitler speaking at a torchlight thing, some old photos I had gotten from the National Archives. Not only did he give these huge mass rallies at night, but a Nazi rally was a great spectacle, as you had said. He had these brown shirt goon squads that were his stormtroopers, his paramilitary organization. that would act as the bouncers during the rally. And they actually profited from the fact that communists would come and would try to shout Hitler down, and then the brown shirts would charge into the audience, usually with things like socks with gravel and rocks in them, and beat the communist up and throw him out of the meeting. And so this was a great spectacle, and usually the meetings were held in these huge cavernous beer halls, and well, let's say beer sort of helped the sentiments flow. And to a German audience, and this of course was in the days before TV, and although radio was established at the time, very few Germans owned a radio. So this was a spectacle that people could go to see. And at that time, Hitler took advantage of it and poisoned them with his hatred, with his extreme nationalism and his anti-Semitism.
What kinds of numbers of recruits or people do you think were affected by these rallies? What kind of, do you have any numbers? Would thousands leave and say, yes, I'm joining the Nazi Party today? Would it be hundreds? Would there people say they didn't make up their mind? Can you give us an idea on that?
In the early 20s, the Nazi Party was the largest party, or one of the larger parties in southern Germany, but was not spread throughout the country. So in the early 1920s, I would say their strength was, they were getting something like maybe 15-20% of the population in Bavaria in southern Germany. After Hitler attempted his premature coup, and in the mid-1920s, they had 12 deputies in a German parliament of about 600 deputies, so they had very few members. When he really started turning on this campaign at the time of the Depression, their strength went in the early 30s, it leaped up to 190 members in a 600-man parliament. And by 1932, they had over 200, I think almost 250 members in a 600-man parliament. So they then became the largest political party in Germany. Literally, they were converting thousands of people at each rally. These rallies became huge right before he took over power. They couldn't be held in beer halls anymore. They had to be held in sports stadiums. And people had to be turned away. They'd have speakers set up outside the stadium so the crowd that couldn't get into the stadium could hear the speech.
And the reason it's important to have somebody like you on here talking, James, is because people need to know the mindset of the times. Occasionally, I wind up in a discussion with somebody, black and white, about Hitler and Germany, and they don't understand what led up to it, the things you're talking about today, how the people thought, and why they decided, yes, this is our future here. And I assume that that's why you decided to do more research on these kinds of things as well, to answer these questions. But do you find that a lot of people also tend to think in black and white? Because certainly America became very patriotic during World War II. We went over and got involved, and when a lot of people, it's just a this or that thing in a discussion of Hitler, World War II, and Germany. They don't understand the mindset of why these people thought this party was so wonderful.
I think the important thing, I think you're 100% right, Eliot. The important thing about this is you have to understand that Hitler wasn't, today we look upon him as a ridiculous kind of figure, a monster.
Right.
People at the time didn't have that advantage, and it's important from a historical standpoint, because if you consider somebody like Saddam Hussein today, his people in Iraq don't have the same advantage that we do of knowing all the facts. And a dictator is not going to appear to the people that he's appealing to as a monster. He's going to try to use whatever issues are the popular issues of the day to appear as a sort of hero, as their protector, as Hitler did. And that's the importance. You have to know that historical context to be able to see, because these dangers, I mean, anti-Semitism, totalitarianism, unfortunately, is not something that's disappeared from the world.
Do you remember when Marge Schott, the owner of a prominent baseball team in America, this is what, about 3 years ago, came out and made a comment saying, well, Hitler wasn't so bad when he started, and there was a reaction that spread throughout this country and others, and essentially she was blacklisted. And those of us who study history, I didn't get swept up into the emotional part of this, because what she was saying was what you are talking about today.
Well, I think with a certain qualification. I mean, Hitler was certainly bad from the beginning. I mean, he was an anti-Semite. He was a rabid nationalist.
I know, but his appeal to the people there...
Sure, the people didn't realize that. And they were, and of course, some of them, many Germans, were anti-Semitic themselves. And, but he played on other issues that were legitimate issues, like the inflation and the Depression. And through those issues was able to get people to believe the anti-Semitism and the rabid nationalism.
But when she made that statement, I thought, again, it was a black and white issue that people didn't understand. I don't know if Marge studies history or if she reads history books, and she was trying to say that, yes, there were literally thousands and hundreds of thousands of people who looked at this man and thought he was the savior of their political economic system. To them, he was not this monster. And I thought that the initial reaction did not give her a chance to even explain any of this. If maybe she reads a lot, she's a student of history, I don't know. I just, being somebody who loves to look into history, which is why obviously you're on this show today, is I try not to react emotionally when these kinds of things happen, because I think there's a huge gray area in there.
Well, I think, the importance of understanding the historical background, and but Hitler was somebody who was really bad from the beginning, but had a ability to appeal to people.
Yes. We are talking to James Poole, the author of Who Financed Hitler? Hitler and His Secret Partners. And, Jim, I think most people want to know more about who these people were. Doing the financing, names we might recognize. Obviously, the Ford thing is just too much for some people. It's just like, well, are you sure? People are hearing about this kind of thing for the first time. And their reaction is, no, there's no way. Because, again, they equate the whole Ford Motor Company. And Henry Ford essentially created the $5 a day assembly line here in this country, increased productivity, and revolutionized industry in America. And then to hear these kinds of things. So let's get into more of the companies or people that might shock us or surprise us.
Well, the one that I had mentioned, Fritz Tusson, is a name that's not well known in the United States, but very well known in Germany, because it was a great steel fortune. That'd be like in America the equivalent of Andrew Carnegie or somebody like that. So Tusson was an extremely wealthy man who was the largest single contributor to the Nazi Party before they came to power. But at the depth of the Depression in 1923, when the Nazi Party was holding these tremendous rallies, when they had become the largest party in the nation, but did not have a majority in Parliament, so they couldn't get into power. There was a time when things were very touch and go between whether Germany would go to the Nazis or to the communists. And the established conservative parties at that time decided that they would try to form an alliance with Hitler and use his mass following. The generals controlling the secret army funds were thinking the same way. When the Depression started, they began to funnel money to the Nazis again so that the Nazis could maintain this huge brown shirt militia. because a lot of these generals and a lot of these industrialists were extreme German nationalists who, even before World War I, had the idea in mind that they wanted Germany to become the dominant industrial and military power on the continent. And even before World War I, they were planning an expansionist war into Russia. Now, of course, with World War I, it didn't turn out the way they had hoped. But they were hoping for a revival, and they thought Hitler was possibly the man to do it. Most of them would have preferred a monarchy, but they realized that the general public really wasn't enthralled by monarchy anymore. And they could see this tremendous phenomenon, these unemployed people that were flocking to Hitler. So some big bankers started to work with Hitler. A banker named Helmar von Schlacht, who had been president of the Reichsbank, tried to gather other bankers and arrange financing for a possible Hitler government. Another banker named Kurt Schroeder, who was a very powerful international banker with connections internationally, arranged a meeting at his home between Hitler and von Papen, who was the leader of the conservative faction. And it was there that they cemented the alliance. And within a few months, this conservative Nazi alliance came to power, and Hitler was appointed chancellor. A key man at this time was old President von Hindenburg, who, although he was about 80 years old, was president of Germany, and he really had the power to decide who would become chancellor. Now, for people familiar with history, they will remember that von Hindenburg was a German general who had been the commander of Germany's armies during World War I and had tremendous prestige. He was sort of like the father of the nation. He looked like a kind of an old sleepy walrus with a big walrus mustache, wore one of those spiked German helmets. And he had been a great war leader. But as president, he was really a little bit too senile and a little bit too old. And he didn't like Hitler because he had the traditional officer's kind of attitude that Hitler was somebody from the lower classes. In fact, he made a side comment to one of his cronies. He said, this fellow Hitler, at best I could see making him in charge of the postal service. But the Nazis got to him because he had deeded his estates to his son before his death to avoid inheritance tax, a maneuver that was technically illegal, a sort of scandal thing. And when Hitler and his cronies learned about that, particularly a man named von Ribbentrop, who later became Hitler's foreign minister, who was a wealthy champagne dealer, had helped Hitler find out some of these scandals. They used it to blackmail Hindenburg's son, saying, if you get your father to support us and get your father to go along and make Hitler chancellor, we won't expose this. If you don't, we're the largest party in the parliament. We'll bring it out. Your father will be disgraced. So old Hindenburg went along, and in 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor. And this was really he was in power then. And the first thing he did was he took his Nazi stormtroopers, the brown shirts that numbered a couple 100,000 men, and he put a special armband on them with a badge on it and made them auxiliary policemen. And from that moment on, for anybody of liberal opinions, for any Jews, for anybody who was an anti-Nazi, life was hell in Germany, because these goons just in an instant became policemen. Swinging billy clubs and carrying weapons.
Is this a well-known story about them threatening to blackmail Hindenburg?
No, it really isn't that well known. I think, again, because the economic factor is largely ignored, and it's something that some people had mentioned but minimized, and I think it was extremely important, because it was at a particular meeting at a party that was given by von Ribbentrop that Hindenburg's son attended and met alone with Hitler for about a half an hour. And when he left that meeting, incidentally, going to the meeting, he had taken all kinds of precautions to avoid reporters. He had walked several blocks in the rain and the snow to catch a cab. And this was somebody that was normally used to getting in a limousine and being taken wherever he wanted to go. He had walked through the snow and the rain to elude reporters and everything, to meet secretly with Hitler at Ribbentrop's house. And on the way back, he said to his assistant who had gone with him, he said, it's unavoidable. The Nazis will have to be taken into the cabinet, meaning Hitler would become chancellor. So I think, again, it's the kind of thing that's been neglected, and it was actually very important.
James Poole is our guest. He's the author of Who Financed Hitler? Hitler and His Secret Partners. What other U.S. names might we be familiar with other than Henry Ford that either provided money directly or any other kind of assistance?
Well, I'm going to get to one in a minute, and that person is Joe Kennedy, the father of JFK. But Joe Kennedy didn't quite come into the picture yet. At this point in time, Joe Kennedy this was before he was appointed ambassador to England. After Hitler became chancellor, he started a tremendous wave of persecution against the Jews in Germany. There was a boycott of Jewish businesses where Nazi goons would stand outside of a Jewish-owned department store and beat up anybody that tried to cross their picket line and go in. Joe Kennedy, who had been successful in Boston, in the stock market, and had worked in Hollywood and engineered, built up some of the old studios and engineered various takeovers of various studios, had always been interested in politics, and he got President Roosevelt to appoint him ambassador to England. What a lot of people don't know is Joe Kennedy was very anti-Semitic. I'm not sure where he picked up this anti-Semitism. Some of it was in Hollywood, rivals that he had had with various businessmen in Hollywood who happened to be Jewish. That's about all I could find, but he was certainly anti-Semitic. He often would complain to his cronies and contemptuously speak of other businessmen as Hollywood as those pants pressers or something like that, as a derogatory kind of anti-Semitic comment. Anyway, when he was in England, he was, as U.S. ambassador, he was very worried about communism, which of course was a legitimate fact at the time, but he took a great liking to Hitler. And although Joe Kennedy didn't actually give any of his money to Hitler, he made several attempts to try to arrange international financial deals that would give money to Germany. Because, of course, as you had pointed out earlier in the program, this was the Depression. After World War I, Germany was very poor. And if Hitler was planning this expansionist war, he needed money because tanks don't grow on trees. And Joe Kennedy tried to arrange several international financial deals that would set up a tremendous gold loan, a loan of gold bullion to Germany. Actually, the most devastating thing Joe Kennedy did was, it was during this period of Nazi persecution of the Jews in Germany when they were smashing shop windows, and a lot of people throughout the world were up in arms about this, particularly in America. And Joe Kennedy, at a meeting with the German ambassador in London, said to him, and the exact quote is in my book, Hitler and His Secret Partners, but something to the effect that, Hitler could get rid of the Jews if he just did it quietly and didn't make such a fuss about it. Now, I don't think Joe Kennedy at the time, even though he was anti-Semitic, was thinking about extermination and murder. But when the German ambassador reported this back to Hitler, and any comments about the Jews were automatically reported by wire. Hitler read the incoming wire service from the diplomatic corps the very first thing every morning. Anything said about the Jews was the first thing that was on his desk in the morning. When Hitler saw this, you can get rid of the Jews if you just do it quietly, Hitler was thinking exterminations. And of course, when the Holocaust was later put into operation, it was different from those first early persecutions in that they tried to do it quietly.